Alright, so I wanted to do another video, and I'm just going to kind of talk off the head and improvise on some topics that I've been thinking about for a while, and I think they are things that sometimes get sort of brushed over or brushed aside by people who are involved in music education, specifically by people who are involved in teaching advanced harmony and who are involved in things like jazz education and educators who are sort of like entrenched in the musical establishment, if you want to put it that way, especially in colleges. I don't really know what it's like in conservatory versus places like public schools, public colleges, and whatnot. But anyways, to get to the point, what I want to talk about is set theory, and I just want to kind of go over some thoughts that I have about how it's useful and how you can apply it and why even beginners should be thinking about these things. And so for anyone who's wondering, this is going to be a video that is probably more well suited for advanced musicians, people who already know a lot. I'm going to go over a few introductions to what exactly I'm actually talking about, and I'm actually going to talk about how I got to this point of thinking about these topics. But just as a warning, I'm not really going to spend a lot of time on basics or things that you should know before watching this video. So really all I want to explain is what I mean by set theory, and I'm going to do that by telling you how I got to the point of realizing what this even is and how to apply it when learning harmony and whatnot. So, the basic story of how I've learned music from beginner to where I'm at now is pretty similar to how a lot of people learn music. I'm a guitar player. This channel is mainly for guitar players. And so, I started off by learning songs using tablature. I had already learned how to read music for piano and for, I think it was trumpet in high school and middle school, yeah. And then I realized that I actually really like guitar. I like listening to guitar music, so I started learning tablature by myself. After a little while, I feel like I'm not really able to teach myself what I want to know more of, so I go and I start taking lessons. While I'm taking lessons, I kind of am introduced to the idea of reading music on guitar, which is more or less everybody's basic introduction to music theory. You don't typically start talking about harmony and things like scales and modes and triads and chords and all that stuff until you've been reading music for a while, right? So I start reading music on guitar. I think it was either with like a Mel Bay book or something like that. But anyways, and after a certain point of learning a lot of songs using tablature, learning a lot of songs reading music, I get to the point where I'm realizing that I'm still missing something because I want to figure out what it is the guys I'm listening to are doing, and I don't know what they're doing, right? So I kind of bring that up and start getting steered towards learning how to improvise by my guitar teacher at the time. And this is how I feel like a lot of people start to really get into music theory. The other road would also be through learning how to compose, or saying something like, teacher, I want to learn how to write songs, right? And of course, you can do this without really knowing much about music theory. I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who just learn songs with tabs, or just read a lot of music and eventually just sort of start writing songs on their own by, let's say, like memorizing things or putting things together in a new way. So yeah, I started learning how to improvise, basically, and that required me to learn what people are talking about when they say scales, and eventually that led me towards going to school for music, and learning as much as I could there. And I did this in a jazz department, so I learned a lot more about music theory from the perspective of chord scale relationships, right? So through that whole process, I'm learning, okay, what's a major chord? What are the notes in a major chord? Why do we call it this? Why are those notes part of the major chord? All this stuff. And you learn a lot of history, but for me, I was never really interested in that sort of thing. I just wanted to learn about the technical aspects of knowing what's going on, knowing what I can do, knowing how I can teach myself new things to do, and kind of going from there. So, you go through scales, you learn the triads in your scales, your major scale, for example. You learn all the triads of the C major scale, and they say, okay, learn it in all keys, and then you learn that stuff. And then you start talking about seventh chords, which involve 4 different notes per chord. And then you move on to extended chords, and you start talking about ninth chords, which of course have 5 individual notes in them, and so on and so forth. And eventually you start getting into talking about the triads and 7th chords and extended chords in harmonic minor scales, and you talk about it in your melodic minor scales. And this progression kind of mirrors the sort of music theory progression you can learn or experience in a classical setting as well, because in school, of course, I was in jazz classes most of the time and paying the most attention in those classes, but also learning similar concepts in the courses that were being taught from a more classical focused background. So anyways, you start out with your majors, you learn all those modes, all those chords, all those triads. You move on to harmonic minor, melodic minor, and then you can start talking about symmetrical scales. Usually that's about as far as most people get in terms of advanced harmony, which in and of itself, those 5 scales you can learn and use for your entire life and have a lot of variety in your musical palette. So anyways, yeah, so by the time you get to like the whole tone scale and the octatonic diminished scale, or in jazz parlance you could say the half-whole scale or the whole half scale, either or, they're both used in jazz music. You've kind of got a lot to work with, and beyond that, you don't really talk much about other scales, or so I've found. For some reason, my teachers brought up the idea of the harmonic major scale, which is basically just a major scale, but instead of a natural 6, it's a flat 6. And, of course, everybody talks about blues scales and pentatonic scales as well, and that's pretty much the entire palette, unless you get really deep into jazz and you start talking about bebop scales. So, through school I learned about all this stuff, and a lot of my teachers would say things like, and this is one of the things that stuck with me the most, I think, that I never really understood, but I just kept thinking about it, and now it makes a lot of sense. And so this is going to be partly what this video is about and showing in support of, trying to convince you of, is that triads and learning your triads as a jazz player, as a rock player, as any sort of musician who is involved in writing music or improvising music of any kind, even just singing it and performing it, triads are much more important to learn and to be very good at and to understand very fully and thoroughly than understanding scales by themselves. And for a long time, this didn't make much sense to me because I guess I hadn't spent enough time thinking about it or listening to music. So anyways, and just if anybody's watching this, there's a high chance my computer could shut down, so if it does, I'll try and redo this video in full. But anyways, yeah, so there's this idea, right, that triads are more important to learn and to be very versed in than the scales themselves. And then you could go on to say that even learning seventh chords and being very good at those are more important to learn than scales, right? And as I practiced this, it didn't make sense to me thinking about it or even hearing what my playing was like when I was focusing on triads, because it always sounded so bland and so plain and kind of simple in a way that wasn't exciting to me. So I think that might have been why it never clicked initially. But anyways, so yeah, so how did I get to the point of thinking about set theory if all I was really told about as far as like scales and harmony goes sort of ended at octatonic scales and bebop scales, and as far as classical theory goes, it really ends with what's it called? With things like 12-tone rows and such, where you're using all 12 notes of the chromatic scale. I feel like most people get to the point in their education or their learning where they're made aware that these things exist, but nobody really dives deeper into what can be done with these things. It kind of just stops. And I feel like people don't realize how much more material there is to learn. And so I want to kind of demonstrate that. And so what do I mean by set theory? Well, I'm coming at it from that end point in college where I felt like there was a lot more to what was going on behind the scenes of some of these great jazz improvisers and some of the musicians that I love writing music, but I didn't really know how to get to that point of understanding what else is going on, because it sounded like there was so much else going on, right? Than just learning the seventh chords, learning which scales can be played over those seventh chords, and so on and so forth. So at some point I realized that there were 3 different pentatonic scales in every major scale. So if you want to think about it from the point of a major pentatonic scale, for example, in C major, you can play a C major pentatonic scale using all the notes using notes that are drawn from the C major scale. You can play an F major pentatonic scale, and you can play a G major pentatonic scale. And so this is kind of similar to how you've got 7 different types of triads, or what are classically thought of as triads within a major scale. And this concept kind of applies to other scales. So there are 7 different kinds of triads in the harmonic minor scales, in the melodic minor scales, in the harmonic major, like I mentioned. And there are a lot of different triads in your octatonic scales, and there are even triads in the whole tone scale, and there are triads in the bebop scale. So, I started thinking about these things and decided to basically figure out what kinds of pentatonic scales I could use as substitutions, or what kind of pentatonic scales I could superimpose over certain chords, right? So, for example, if you're looking at just a plain old minor 7 chord, and you're thinking about it in sort of a more advanced jazz way, where you're thinking rather than playing across a chord progression, you're playing licks or riffs or whatever that are a little more focused on each chord individually. So you've got a minor 7 chord that might be the 2 of a 2-5-1 progression, but if you're sort of at a more advanced level, you can start doing more interesting substitutions over that chord that don't necessarily imply that this is a 2 chord in a 2-5-1 progression. And this is kind of what a lot of jazz players are doing, at least what I hear a lot of guys doing, to take their playing and their improvising to the next level of emotional expression, right? So it's like figuring out how these guys are playing all these weird but really awesome sounding notes in their solos and stuff like that, right? So for me, trying to conceptualize these things started by thinking about pentatonic scales and how I can substitute them over, or rather superimpose them over certain chords, right? So if you're just using minor pentatonic scales drawn from the major scales that are available to you, what you'll find is there are actually 5, I believe, different pentatonic scales you can play over a plain old minor 7 chord, for example. So if you're using, let's keep talking about C major because that's what everybody loves to do, right? It's so simple, huh? And you're playing a 2-5-1 chord progression over that D minor 7, the 2 chord, you could play a D minor pentatonic scale if you wanted to. You could play either of the other 2 minor pentatonic scales over that chord progression that are in the C major scale that this D minor 7 is being drawn from. So those other 2 scales would be your E minor pentatonic scale and also your A minor pentatonic scale, right? So you can play it from the 1 of the D minor 7 chord, you can play it from the 2 of the D minor 7 chord, or you can play it from the 5, which would be A. And what I realized is that there are D minor 7 chords in other major scales. So off the top of my head, I'm not sure which ones those are, but I can say that I found you can also play a minor pentatonic scale from the flat 7 of this D minor 7 chord that we're talking about, which would imply, or it would sound kind of like you're playing D Phrygian rather than D Dorian, right? Or you can play a G minor pentatonic scale over this D minor 7, right? So that's kind of where this sort of advancement began for me personally, right? And what I started thinking about while I was trying to figure these things out was, what are all the possibilities here? How can I figure out what all the possibilities are based on what I know about chord scale theory and how scales match up with chords and in what instances and why and stuff like that, right? So the point is, how do we know what all of the possibilities for harmony are, right? And this is how I started to move towards thinking about set theory. And so I think the next step in the evolution of this thought for me, because like I said, I'm not really that interested in music history. It's very important for different reasons, but for me I was just thinking about it from a purely playing oriented music, like played, heard, performed music perspective, right? So at this point I'm trying to think of all possibilities that I can play. So I was, through my own contemplation, I was pointed back towards triads again. And what I realized is, or rather what I started thinking about, is how there are other triads that are less commonly talked about but are nonetheless still very important. And so what do I mean by this? I mean, in the C major scale, if you would say that there is a C major triad there, you could also turn that triad into a sus chord of some kind and get a different sort of triad. So, for example, you could have a C sus2 chord, which would have a C, a D, and a G, or you could have a C sus4 chord, which would have a C, an F, and a G, for example. And I realized that there are a lot of these kinds of sus chords within the scales that I was already, or so I thought, within these scales that I thought I was already very familiar with and very acquainted with. Come to find out, I wasn't actually as familiar with these as I could be. So I kind of followed that line of thought to the point of breaking down how many just basic sus triads there are and what the different forms of them are within all of the scales that I mentioned before. So your major scale, harmonic minor, melodic minor, the whole tone, and the octatonic scales. Basically, that's it. I didn't really do much with bebop scales. So at that point, I kind of started to realize, oh, but there are other possibilities here. There are other sets of 3 notes, and this is why I came to the realization that what I'm thinking about is set theory, because I started thinking about these things not as the classically defined triad that everybody learns about in music theory and typically in classical music theory, but of course in other things. And like I said, I'm not interested in history, but there are historical reasons why people started calling them triads and things like that, right? So I kind of started to divorce my thinking from that historical tradition of teaching. And this might start to kind of explain the things that I was saying about educators being entrenched in certain ways of thinking and how it kind of leaves people with a lot of gaps in their musical understanding. So I came to the point where I realized that in between all of these sus chords that you can find, all these sus triads, suspended is what that means. And at this point, I am willing to bet that most of the beginners or people who are getting bored have tuned out, so maybe anybody who's left already knows what I'm talking about mostly. But anyways, yeah, so once I realized that all these sus triads were there and that there were still more combinations of 3 notes that could be derived from this set of 12 notes that we use in the quote-unquote Western musical world, I started to break those down. And I realized that you could do this for sets of 2 notes, which a lot of people know as intervals, or you could say they're dyads as well. Sets of 3 notes, sets of 4 notes, all the way up to sets of 12 notes, which of course there's only one from 12 different root notes. And so this is what I'm talking about when I say set theory in music, okay? And what I have seen people do, or what I'm used to people doing when I start talking about these things in casual conversation, which of course is rare because who actually knows much about music theory or even cares these days? Usually what people say is, oh, well, I know what you're talking about, but I'm not interested in atonal music. And the conversation just ends there, typically. So I say set theory, and people immediately think atonalism, serial music, 12-tone rows, things like that, right? Which is not at all what I am interested in talking about, and I think that people who sort of shut off and sort of say, yeah, I know what you're saying, but I don't like it because that's just atonalism, I think there's a fundamental mistake being made there, because there's still tonal gravity. It's just not as, what would the word be? It's just not as dependent on the traditions of classical music education that is rooted in sort of a historical progression of how Western music has evolved, which leads one to focusing on, things like dominance, subdominance, all that stuff. And they focus on the major scale and whatnot. But there's actually so much more music that can be written that still is beautiful in the way that music is that's composed using only major scales or only classical harmony or only traditional jazz harmony. But it's not as rooted in the history. It's kind of, and I think this is essentially what people need to realize in order for there to be a more broad and free musical expression in the world. And I'm going to make a lot of sweeping statements like that, so, take it with a grain of salt. But anyways, so set theory, right? It's music theory that is focused on sets of notes, what sets of notes there can be, and how they kind of interact with each other, and what can be done with these things in this way of thinking as far as writing songs, composing, writing melodies, improvising, writing bass lines, whatever. And I think this is particularly important for people who are looking for interesting chord substitutions or interesting ways of superimposing new ideas over the top of chord progressions, things like that, right? So I'm going to say it again, that learning triads and being very well versed in your triads is much more important than learning your major scales, your harmonic minor scales, whatever. If you know cold all the triads that exist, you can pretty much take any of them in any key and put them together in different combinations and different chord progressions to basically imply any musical scale that you want to imply, any sort of larger musical structure, right? And so that's what this video is mainly going to be about. So I think at this point, it's a 27-minute intro. I'm just going to get into what I want to do. And so what I've done, and I'm going to screen share this, what I have done is create two different spreadsheets here with all the modes of all the scales that I mentioned in the intro, and I've listed them not with pitch letter names like C or D, but I've instead listed them as numbers, okay? So I've got one set here, I've called it Mapping the Gaps, and I've got another sheet. Let's see, I should do this in like this, that just has the, and you're just going to have to trust me on this because I did this with programs, but I've just got a list of all of the sets of 2 notes that you can derive from the 12-note scale, the 12-note chromatic scale, every set of 3 notes, 4 notes, and 5 notes. And so for those of you who are maybe a little confused seeing this at first, the numbers that you'll see are only the numbers between 1 and 12, okay? So 1 obviously is going to be the root note, 2 is going to be the flat 2, 3 is the natural 2, 4 would be the flat 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, all of these. So like 8 is the 5th, 9 is the augmented 5th or the flat 6th, 12 of course is the natural 7th, and so on and so forth, okay? And what I want to do at some point later is to make a few more introductory videos that break this stuff down into more basic and beginner pieces to kind of build back up to the point of having this discussion we're having now. But I'm just so eager to get through this video that I'm just going to skip to this topic. So anyways, so what we're going to be doing is copying what I've found here. Okay, so for example, what I've got highlighted here is your major pentatonic scale. So what it consists of is a root, a natural 2, a natural 3, a 5th, and a natural 6th, right? And so what I've got in these columns, and what I've done is organize these in terms of each mode of each scale that we've got going on here. So it's going to progress from major pentatonic through all those modes. Then we're going to talk about the blues scale. So we're going to start with the minor blues and then move through every mode of the minor blues. And then I just kind of skipped to the whole tone, which doesn't make much sense, but anyways. Then there's, of course, the whole tone scale, which only has, technically speaking, one mode because it's symmetrical. And then we're going to work through all of the major scales and their modes. And they're all named here. Then we're going to work through the harmonic minor scale and all those modes. And then we're going to work through melodic minor. And we're going to move on to, I believe, the 3 bebop scales. So I started with the Bebop Dominant because you typically learn that one before all of the other ones. And we're going to talk about all the modes of that scale. They're just all listed here. And then we'll talk about the octatonic diminished, or the half whole and whole half scales. Then we go on to the second Bebop Dorian mode and all of its modes. The second Bebop Dorian scale and all of its modes. And then we're going to move to Bebop Major, or as it's called by the famous jazz educator Barry Harris. I think I'm getting his name right. The diminished 6th scale. And then after that one, we're going to talk about the Bebop Melodic Minor scale. And then finally, after all of this, we're going to talk about the Harmonic Major scale and all of its modes. And what I'm going to do, I haven't done this yet before, so we're both going to be learning this stuff together. But what I've done, I've listed all the scale degrees of each mode here, of each scale of each mode. And then next to it in these columns, I've broken it down into sets of 2 notes, sets of 3 notes, sets of 4 notes, and sets of 5 notes. And I just decided to stop at the 5-note sets to keep things a little bit more manageable. And so anyways, what we're going to be doing is taking each of these sets of notes here, and as we're going to be removing them from this sheet here, which has, like I said, listed out all of the scales and all of their sets of 2 notes, 3 notes, 4, and 5. And we're going to be progressively removing what we take from here. And we're going to be also removing them from this sheet, which has every single possible combination of 4, 5, 3, and 2 notes, right? And so what we're going to be left with when we get through all of this is basically we're either going to be left with a completely blank sheet, or we're going to be left with a couple of sets of notes that you cannot derive from these scales that we have over here. Okay, so and that'll become that'll seem more important the more we do this. Okay, so I just want to reiterate the point that I made earlier, and the point that my teachers continued to reiterate to me, is that learning triads is more important than learning scales. And so I'm kind of taking this to an extreme here and saying learning small sets of notes and knowing how to put them together in different ways and take them from different scales and such is much more important than learning the scales themselves, because you can combine these sets of 2 notes or 3 notes or 4 or 5 in different ways to basically imply whatever scale you want. Okay, so we're just gonna plow along, and if that's not clear, I think it will become more clear as we move along here. So anyways, let's get started. So this first set here, we're taking it from the major pentatonic scale, and that is the 2-note set, or the 2-note interval of a major second. So we're going to remove all the major seconds from this sheet and match entire cell contents, and we're just going to replace it with a space. We're going to replace all of them. So we'll see if we run into any problems or errors. So you'll see that this one here is gone from the major pentatonic mode set, or whatever you want to call it. And in the second mode of major pentatonic, it also begins with that same interval. That one's gone. So every other scale on this list that has an interval of a major second to begin with, or at some point in the scale, has now been removed from this sheet. So we're just going to move over here. We're going to remove it from this sheet as well. And there's only one, right? That's correct. Pretty much what we'd expect. Alright, so the second one, just want to, well, here's what we're going to do. Going to remove it. We're going to look for all the other ones in this sheet. So now we're looking at the major third interval. Those are all gone. And of course, we will find it in here as well. And so I guess another way to put this is you can find certain intervals in certain scales. And if you're thinking about this from the perspective of each of the 12 potential root notes, there are, of course, 12 different major seconds, if you want to put it that way. And you can draw each of those from those scales to use them in other contexts. And so I might make a video later at some point looking at the same concept from the point of actually using pitch letter names like C or D or E or whatever. But for now we're just going to be looking at this in a more abstract way. So, and I guess I just realized the other thing that I've forgotten to say here is what I want to do as we're progressively moving through all these modes is point out at what point we've already found scales that contain each of these note sets. So, in other words, the question is, which scales do you actually need to learn in order to be able to practice every set of 2 notes, for example? So, I mean, for 2 notes, I already know the answer. You have to learn, all you have to learn is the major pentatonic scale and its modes, and the major scale and its modes, and at that point, in every key, you have got access to every single set of 2 notes, or every single set of 2-note intervals that you can possibly play in music. And that's fairly easy to conceptualize. I think it's a little bit more challenging to think well, at what point will I have gained access, so to speak, to all the sets that exist of 3 notes? And my hypothesis is that all you need for the 3-note sets are the major pentatonic scale, the major scale itself, and the blues scale. I think I'm going to be proven wrong. And then for the 4-note scales, I have absolutely no idea at what point we'll hit all of these. And for the 5-note scales, or the 5-note sets, excuse me, I'm pretty sure that all of the scales I have listed here will actually not cover all of the 5 notes. So this might be somewhat tedious. Oh, I think I ran into a problem there. Yep. Okay, I forgot to click match entire cell contents for that one. Right, so cool, perfect. Okay, now back on track. So if that doesn't make sense, I guess you can leave a comment or something. I'm not really going to be able to pay attention to chat, and I don't expect that anybody's actually going to be watching this. And I'm not so professional as to make this entertaining, and I don't expect that it will be or should be. So anyways, we are going to remove all the instances of a major 5th, and as expected, right here in the sets of 2 notes, it disappears. So we've covered that. Now this is gone, and in this sheet we'll also remove it. So a major 5th, and we can look at it here, major 5ths appear 50 different times across all of these scales that we have listed. Kind of interesting to note, and I'm not going to point out every single one of these, every single one of those observations, but anyway, so now we're moving on to a major 6th, and we want to see how many times this appears. It appears 47 times, if I'm doing this right. And we're going to remove it from our list over here. 1 time, gone. Alright, so now at this point we have looked at all of the sets of 2 notes, or all of the intervals that are contained within a major pentatonic scale. Now we're going to move on to the second mode of the major pentatonic scale, which includes a perfect 4th right here. And we're going to remove all of those. So the perfect 4th appears 51 times. Somewhat interesting, kind of a nerdy statistic. And as we can expect, there is only one perfect 4th by itself in this list here. Alright, so now this is a minor 7th, and we're going to remove it from the sheet. 46 minor 7ths. And we're going to also remove it from this sheet. Alright, as expected, there's only one. Okay, so that takes care of all of the intervals that appear in the second mode of major pentatonic. And the reason I'm removing each interval from the entirety of this sheet as we go is because you'll find that there are a lot of repeated intervals, or in other words, the intervals that we're removing are found in many modes, in many scales. So we don't necessarily want to go over every single instance of that. We just want to know at what point have we learned all of them. So by the time we get to the third mode of major pentatonic, we have two other intervals we've not seen yet, and that is the minor third and the minor sixth. So let's go ahead and remove those. So those are all gone. And that's gone. And now we've got our minor sixth. Let's just check on the stream real quick. Looks like it's up. Okay. Alright, and that looks pretty good so far. Let's remove it from here. Now it's gone. So now we are still waiting to find a scale that has a minor second, a tritone, and a major seventh. And so at this point we've covered all of the intervals that appear in all of the modes of the major pentatonic scale, and technically speaking we've only learned the major pentatonic modes from 1 to 3, so the first mode, the second mode, and the third mode. So that kind of what I kind of am trying to get across here is you could learn all of your major pentatonic modes, all of your second modes of major pentatonic, and your thirds, and take the intervals you learn from those modes and put them together in new ways, and you would already cover the rest of the modes of the major pentatonic scale, which are the fourth mode and of course the fifth mode, or in other words the minor pentatonic scale. So let's move on. So now we're looking at the minor blues scale, and of course we find our triad, or in other words the blue note. Okay, and those are all gone, and now these are all gone. So now we're only looking for two more, and so we find our first instance of a minor second in the third mode of the minor blues. And that's gone, and now what we're just looking for is where the first instance of a major seventh will be. And it looks like we found it in the fourth mode of the minor blues. So by the time you've learned only 3 modes of the major pentatonic scale and only 4 modes of the minor blues scale, you have already learned essentially where all of the 2-note intervals in all keys will be. Okay, so if you learn all of your major pentatonic scales from every note, in all keys, in other words, and you learn the second and third mode in all keys, and then you learn each of the first 4 modes of the minor blues in all keys as well, you essentially have enough material to start putting those things together in new ways that are going to enable you to imply everything in music, but only using sets of 2 notes, or in other words, interval sets. So this kind of sound is extremely sparse, and it's interesting, but it's not interesting by itself necessarily. And I find that it would get pretty old pretty quick, pretty boring, which is why people move towards sets of 3 notes and 4 and 5 and melodies using lots of sets of notes and things like that. So, and like I said, I haven't really planned much except for setting up these sheets for this video. So I'm pretty much winging it. right now and learning this with you as we go. So now I'm just going to scroll down, and you'll see that every single interval in all of these scales have already disappeared. And this is what I think, in some sense, my teachers have been trying to show me by saying over and over and over again that learning your triads and learning your intervals are much more important than actually learning the scales themselves. So, like I thought, it didn't take long. And you can basically, I'll put this another way, you can make the major pentatonic scale and the minor blues scale go a long, long way. But you can only do it if you're thinking about things with this set theory mentality, where you're looking at what combinations of how many notes exist and how can I find them and how can I use them. So let's just go ahead and remove this last interval, and let's move on to the triads, which is where things start to get a little bit more interesting, or so I think. So we're just going to start back at the major pentatonic scale, and I don't really want to go through and name all of these. That's a little bit more tedious of a task than I think I have the energy to do right now, so I'm just going to kind of see if I can speed things up a bit here. And as I reach stopping points, I'll make notes. So, here we go. All right, next one. Alright, so we've gone through all of the 3-note sets from the major pentatonic. Now we're going to move on to the minor pentatonic, or excuse me, the second mode of major pentatonic. And there's still a lot of sets of 3 notes left, as should be expected. And I really wish I had a way to sort of automate this, but I think doing it by hand is going to be a little bit better for making this video version. Alright, going through the second mode now, moving on to the third. Alright, now we've gone through the third mode of the major pentatonic scale, and we're seeing a lot more gaps now, but there's certainly a lot more sets of 3 notes to go through and cross off this list. However, you can see that you've pretty much covered all of the unique sets of 3 notes by only learning these first 3 modes of the major pentatonic scale. There's only 2 more unique sets in these modes left. Alright, so now we've moved through all of the sets of 3 notes in the major pentatonic scale and its modes. We're going to move on to the minor blues, which is going to give us a lot of the sets of 3 notes with tritones in them. Okay, now we're going to move on to the second mode, which is also known as the major blues. Alright, so we've gone through the major blues now, and we've got a lot less left. And I'm going to say my point in a different way at this point. This video should pretty clearly show, well, maybe not through all the abstract stuff, but anyways, I guess the point of this video is to show just how few scales you need to learn in order to make a whole lot of music. And that it's not a matter of simply knowing the scales themselves, it's a matter of knowing all of the little pieces of the scales and how they go together and how you can take them apart and put them together in new ways. Because if you approach a scale by just learning the whole scale and you just are constantly playing the whole scale, it's going to sound kind of boring after a while. But if you approach learning scales from a place of learning the small pieces of each scale and kind of hinting at the whole scale, but never really giving away the whole thing, you can kind of build a little bit more interest over a longer period of time. Alright, so we've gone now through the third mode of the minor blues. Those are all gone. And I just want to point out that it looks like the fourth mode of the minor blues scale has got a lot of unique triads in it. And when I say triads, I mean just simply three sets of three notes. So that's kind of interesting to point out. We're going to continue on anyways, though. So I guess what you could say is that if you're a musician who's looking to change up your sound or find new sounds to experiment with, maybe you should look into learning. Maybe you should look into learning the fourth mode of the minor blues really well and playing around with that. And I've got a cat coming in here to bother me. That's okay, we're going to continue on. And this cat is probably going to distract me a little bit, but I'm going to try and stay focused and not screw up. And he is going to try get up on this table. Oh man, if he knocks my cord out, I'm going to be screwed. Guess I already did that one. Alright, and so by the time you get to the fourth mode of the minor blues, you've covered almost every single three-note set. Most of them, for sure. Alright, now we've moved through the fifth mode of the minor blues. Now we're moving on to the last mode, the sixth mode. Alright, so at this point we have taken a look at every set of 3 notes that you could possibly derive from both the major pentatonic scale and all of its modes, as well as the minor blues scale and all of the modes of the minor blues scale. And we've compared them to all of the sets of 3 notes that you could possibly derive from the chromatic scale. And it looks like there are only, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There are only 10 other sets of 3 notes that you would need to learn other scales to play. That's pretty crazy. In other words, you can get way farther than I think most people realize by only learning and mastering to this degree of detailedness your minor blues scale and your minor blues modes, and your major pentatonic scale and your major pentatonic modes. And if you break it down into what the sets of 2 notes and 3 notes are and practice all of them cold and be able to know them all cold and just bust them out at any time, you're going to be able to apply those small fragments of these scales in contexts so far outside of just the context of this scale itself. So it looks like we'll find the rest of what we're looking for by learning the whole tone scale and the Ionian or the major scale and its modes. I'm getting pretty tired at this point. This video is really long, about an hour, so what I can do is pick this back up at another time and work this video to completion. So I also think that this would probably work better in a written format. And if it's not already clear, there is a lot of material here, and there is a lot of extreme detail that you could get into when you're looking at harmony and 12-tone chromatic harmony, or in other words, just the harmony that comes from this set of 12 notes that we use over in our Western world of music, so to speak. There's so much detail here that you can get into that I think a lot of people miss in traditional music education. And so, yeah, this is just the first video on this topic that I wanted to do. There are obviously a lot more that I could do. There's a lot more detail to get into, and I guess I could just leave you with an explanation of why I think this stuff is important. I mean, it just shows you how detailed things are and how much detail so many people are missing, and really what you can do with some of the most basic introductory scales people learn, the major pentatonic and the minor blues. And I'm kind of losing my focus at this point, so I'm just going to end it there. Thanks for watching, if you watched at all.